There comes a moment in life where effort no longer produces results. You try harder, but nothing moves. You think more, but clarity disappears. You motivate yourself, but the motivation feels hollow, forced, almost fake. And slowly, quietly, the strategies that once worked for you stop working altogether. What makes this moment so disturbing is not just that things fall apart, but that you can't point to a clear reason. There is no dramatic breakdown, no obvious failure. From the outside, your life might even look fine. But internally, something has gone offline. A sense of direction, a sense of meaning, a sense of inner agreement with the life you're living. You wake up tired even after sleeping. Small tasks feel heavy. Things you used to want no longer excite you. And the more you try to fix yourself, the more resistance you feel inside. As if something in you is quietly saying, "No, not this way anymore." Most people interpret this phase as a problem. They assume something is wrong with them, that they've become lazy, ungrateful, weak, unmotivated. They compare themselves to others who seem to be moving forward effortlessly, and the comparison cuts deeper than it used to, because now it doesn't just trigger envy, it triggers panic. Why does everyone else seem to know what they're doing? Why does it feel like I missed some invisible memo about how life is supposed to work? Why does nothing I try seem to land anymore? According to Carl Jung, this is not a breakdown. It is a psychological turning point. A moment where the inner system that carried you through the first half of life begins to collapse under its own weight. Jung observed that in the first part of life, we build ourselves around adaptation. We learn who to be in order to be accepted. We develop a personality that fits our family, our culture, our environment. We become functional, capable, responsible. And for a long time, this works. It brings approval, stability, a sense of identity. But there comes a point where the very structure that once protected you begins to suffocate you. Not because it was wrong, but because it was never meant to be permanent. This is the moment when nothing works anymore. Because the psyche is no longer interested in optimization. It's interested in truth. And truth is rarely convenient. You might notice that your tolerance for superficial conversations disappears. That obligations feel heavier than before. That you feel strangely allergic to expectations you used to meet automatically. Your body may slow you down. Your emotions may intensify. Your mind may feel foggy or restless at the same time. Jung warned that when this phase begins, people often try to go backward. They double down on productivity. They force positivity. They seek external validation even harder. They try to repair a system that is no longer meant to function. But the psyche does not regress politely. It withdraws energy. It removes desire. It creates friction, not to punish you, but to stop you. This is why nothing is working anymore. Because what once worked was built for a version of you that no longer exists. And the most unsettling part is this: there is no clear replacement yet. You are no longer who you were. but you are not yet who you are becoming. You stand in between, in a psychological no man's land, a space Jung described as one of the most dangerous but also most meaningful phases of human development. Most people never receive guidance here, so they label the experience as failure, or depression, or a loss of ambition. They medicate it, distract from it, or shame themselves out of it. But Jung saw something else entirely. He saw this phase as the beginning of individuation, the painful process of separating who you truly are from who you learn to be in order to survive. And individuation always begins the same way, with disorientation, with exhaustion, with the feeling that life has quietly pulled the plug on your old operating system. Nothing is working anymore because it's not supposed to. In the next part, we need to talk about the psychological structure that is collapsing right now. The mask you didn't even realize you were wearing. And why letting it fall apart feels so terrifying, yet so necessary. To understand why this phase feels so unsettling, we need to talk about something Carl Jung called the persona. The persona is not who you are. It's who you learn to be. It's the psychological mask you develop to function in the world. The version of you that knows how to behave, how to perform, how to adapt. The part that learned early on which traits were rewarded and which ones needed to be hidden. Strength instead of vulnerability. Pleasantness instead of truth. Achievement instead of authenticity. For many years, this mask works remarkably well. It helps you succeed. It helps you belong. It helps you survive. And because it brings approval, you mistake it for your identity. But here's the part most people never realize. The persona is meant to be temporary. Jung observed that the persona is necessary in the first half of life, but destructive if you cling to it in the second. Because eventually the cost of maintaining the mask becomes higher than the benefit. This is when the cracks begin to appear. You start to feel strangely disconnected from your own life. You do all the right things, yet feel no inner reward. Compliments land flat. Success feels empty, and the roles you once played effortlessly now drain you. What's breaking down here is not your life. It's the identification with the mask. And this breakdown rarely announces itself clearly. It shows up subtly, as chronic fatigue, as irritation with people you used to please, as a growing intolerance for shallow goals. As the feeling that you're living someone else's script, you may even feel guilt for feeling this way. After all, nothing is wrong on paper. You're functioning. You're coping. You're doing what's expected, but internally, something rebels. Jung warned that when the persona begins to collapse, the psyche pulls energy away from the external world. Ambition fades. Motivation dries up. The desire to impress disappears. Not because you failed, but because your inner system is no longer willing to cooperate with a false identity. This is where many people panic. They interpret the loss of drive as laziness. They label the inner resistance as self-sabotage. They push harder, discipline themselves more strictly, and try to resurrect a version of themselves that no longer fits. But forcing the persona to stay intact only deepens the exhaustion. Because every time you act from the mask instead of the self, you split yourself internally. One part performs, another part withdraws, and the gap between them grows wider. This is why nothing feels aligned anymore. Why even simple decisions feel heavy. Why you hesitate, overthink, or avoid altogether. The psyche is no longer asking, "How do I succeed?" It's asking, "Who am I when I stop performing?" And that question destabilizes everything. The persona dissolving feels like losing control, because the mask gave you certainty, structure, predictability. Without it, you enter unknown territory. You don't know how to define yourself anymore. You don't know what you want, only what you no longer want. You don't know where you're going, only that the old direction feels wrong. This is not confusion by accident. It's confusion by design. Jung believed that the collapse of the persona is a necessary psychological death. A death of the social self. A death of borrowed values. A death of external identity. And every death creates fear, especially when you don't yet see what will replace it. This is why people often describe this phase as feeling lost, empty, or behind in life. Because without the mask, you temporarily lose orientation. But what's actually happening is far more precise. Your psyche is clearing space. And in the next part, we need to talk about what emerges when the persona weakens. The parts of you that were pushed underground for years, and why their return often feels disturbing before it feels liberating. When the persona weakens, something else begins to stir. Not gently, not politely, but with a strange urgency, as if it has been waiting for this moment for a very long time. This is the part of the psyche Carl Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is not pathology. It is simply everything that did not fit the image you learned to uphold. Your anger when you were praised for being kind. Your ambition when you were expected to be modest. Your sensitivity when strength was rewarded. Your needs when self-sacrifice was required. Over time, these parts didn't disappear. They went underground. They adapted by hiding. As long as the persona was strong, the shadow stayed contained. But once the mask begins to crack, the shadow no longer stays silent. This is when people are often caught off guard. Suddenly, emotions intensify. Old memories surface without warning. You feel irritability where you used to feel patience, jealousy where you thought you were over that. Sadness that doesn't seem connected to the present moment. You might think you're regressing, that you're becoming worse instead of better. But Jung observed that this phase is not a step backward. It's a return of psychic material that was never integrated. The shadow doesn't come to destroy you. It comes to be acknowledged. But because society teaches us to value control, clarity, and positivity, the shadow's arrival feels threatening. It disrupts the narrative you had about yourself. It challenges the identity you worked hard to maintain. You may start asking uncomfortable questions. Why do I feel resentment toward people I love? Why am I suddenly so tired of giving? Why do I feel anger when nothing bad is happening? These questions are unsettling because they don't fit the persona, but they make perfect sense to the self. Jung warned that when the shadow is ignored, it doesn't disappear. It leaks out sideways, through anxiety, through psychosomatic symptoms, through exhaustion, numbness, or compulsive behaviors. This is often the phase where people say, "I don't recognize myself anymore." But what they're actually experiencing is the end of a one-sided identity. You are not losing yourself. You are meeting parts of yourself you were never allowed to be. And this meeting is rarely pleasant at first. The shadow carries everything that was inconvenient to your early environment. If you grew up needing to be agreeable, your shadow holds anger. If you had to be strong, your shadow holds grief. If you were valued for achievement, your shadow holds rest and refusal. When these parts return, they don't come as polished insights. They come as raw emotion, as discomfort, as inner friction. This is why so many people try to suppress this phase. They numb it. They distract from it. They label it as dysfunction. But Jung understood something crucial. Without the shadow, individuation cannot continue. You cannot become whole by remaining socially acceptable. Wholeness requires the integration of what you rejected in order to belong. This is also why relationships often change during this phase. You may feel less tolerant of dynamics where you overextend, less willing to explain yourself, less able to betray your own boundaries. Not because you've become cold, but because the shadow has started to speak where you once stayed silent. And here lies the paradox. This phase feels like inner chaos. But psychologically, it is an act of deep reorganization. The psyche is not falling apart. It is redistributing energy, retrieving lost aspects, preparing for a more truthful inner structure. But before that structure can emerge, something else must happen. The ego, the part of you that wants clarity, certainty, and control, has to confront the fact that it is no longer in charge. And that confrontation is what makes the next phase so frightening. In the next part, we need to talk about the loss of direction, why the future suddenly feels blank, and why Jung believed this void is not something to escape, but something to endure. As the persona dissolves and the shadow pushes forward, something else quietly disappears as well. And this is often the moment people find the most frightening. Because what fades is not just motivation or ambition, but the sense of inner orientation that once told you where you were going and why. The future, which once felt structured and predictable, suddenly turns blank, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, unsettling way, as if the internal compass you relied on for years has stopped responding, leaving you with movement but no direction, effort without certainty, and days that blur together without a clear sense of progress. This is the phase where people say they feel lost, but what they actually mean is that the old map no longer applies, and the new one has not yet revealed itself. According to Carl Jung, this experience is not accidental, nor is it pathological, but a precise psychological state that emerges when the ego can no longer lead the personality forward using borrowed values, inherited ambitions, or socially reinforced goals. The ego, whose task is to plan, decide, and control, suddenly finds itself without reliable instructions because the unconscious has withdrawn its support from the old direction, creating a pause that feels like emptiness, stagnation, or even meaninglessness. And the ego hates this pause. It wants answers, clarity, movement, reassurance that something is being achieved, and when none of that is available, it interprets the silence as failure, regression, or loss of potential. But Jung understood that this void is not an absence, but a suspension, a liminal psychological space in which the old identity has already dissolved, while the new one has not yet taken form, making it impossible to move forward without pretending, and impossible to go back without betraying what has already been seen. This is why advice during this phase often feels irritating rather than helpful, because most advice is oriented toward optimization, improvement, or fixing, while the psyche is asking for something radically different. Endurance without answers, presence without control, and patience without guarantees. In this void, the future cannot be imagined in the usual way, because imagination itself has been emptied of its familiar images, and the dreams you once chased no longer carry emotional charge, leaving behind a strange neutrality that feels both calm and terrifying at the same time. People often misinterpret this neutrality as depression, but Jung made a careful distinction between pathological despair and existential emptiness, noting that in individuation, the loss of meaning is often temporary, serving as a psychological clearing where old investments are withdrawn so that new ones can eventually emerge. The problem is that modern culture offers almost no support for this phase. We are taught to fill every gap, to label every pause, to diagnose every moment of not knowing. And so the void becomes something to escape rather than something to inhabit. But Jung warned that those who flee this space prematurely often rebuild a new persona too quickly, adopting a different mask, a different role, a different identity, without ever allowing the deeper self to reorganize the personality from within. This is why people sometimes experience multiple cycles of burnout, relationship collapse, or existential crisis, because each time the psyche asks for depth, the ego responds with substitution rather than surrender. In the void, there is nothing to do in the conventional sense, and this is precisely why it feels unbearable to the ego, which equates worth with movement and value with productivity. Yet psychologically, this stillness is active. Energy is being withdrawn from outdated attachments. Inner images are dissolving. Unconscious material is rearranging itself beneath the surface of awareness. You may feel as if life has placed you on pause, but in reality, something far more fundamental is taking place. The psyche is preparing a new center of gravity, one that no longer revolves around who you were expected to be, but around who you actually are. Jung believed that if a person can tolerate this phase without rushing to define themselves prematurely, the self will eventually begin to speak, not through logic or planning, but through subtle shifts in interest, intuition, and inner resonance. But before that can happen, one final illusion has to be confronted: the illusion that something has gone wrong. In the next part, we need to talk about why this phase is not a mistake, why feeling behind is often a sign of psychological maturity, and why Jung believed that the second half of life follows completely different rules than the first. At some point in this process, often quietly and without drama, a realization begins to surface, not as a thought you can fully articulate, but as a subtle inner shift. The sense that maybe, just maybe, this phase is not evidence of failure, but evidence of transition. According to Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychological mistakes people make during individuation is assuming that the standards of the first half of life still apply to the second, even though the inner task has completely changed. In the first half of life, growth is measured externally, by achievement, by progress, by visibility, by comparison. But in the second half, growth moves inward, and because inward development does not produce immediate external results, it often looks, from the outside and even from within, like stagnation, regression, or being left behind. This is why people in this phase so often feel out of sync with the world around them, as if they are moving at a different tempo, guided by questions that others no longer seem to ask, or perhaps have never asked at all. You may notice that you are less interested in proving yourself, less willing to chase goals that once motivated you, and less capable of pretending that certain paths still matter, even though you cannot yet articulate what should replace them. This is not apathy. It is discernment forming beneath the surface. Jung believed that when the psyche withdraws energy from external striving, it is not abandoning life, but recalibrating its values, slowly and carefully, in a way that cannot be rushed without distortion. The feeling of being behind emerges precisely because the psyche is no longer running on collective timelines, but on an individual rhythm that does not align with social milestones or cultural expectations. And this mismatch can feel deeply isolating. But isolation, in this sense, is not a punishment. It is a consequence of no longer being able to live from borrowed meanings. Nothing is working anymore because what once worked belonged to a life built around adaptation rather than authenticity, and the psyche, once it has tasted truth, cannot unsee it. You cannot unknow what no longer feels right. You cannot re-enter roles that have lost their inner legitimacy. And you cannot force enthusiasm for futures that no longer resonate with who you are becoming. This is why Jung emphasized that individuation often begins with loss rather than gain. Loss of certainty, loss of identity, loss of direction. But loss, psychologically speaking, is not emptiness. It is space. Space for a different relationship to work, to love, to success, to self-worth. You may not yet know what is emerging, and that is not a failure of insight, but a sign that the process is still unfolding at its own pace, beyond the ego's demand for immediate answers. If you find yourself in this phase, unable to move forward, yet unwilling to go back, feeling strangely detached from the life you once wanted, but not yet connected to the life that awaits you, then nothing has gone wrong. You are not broken. You are not late. And you are not losing yourself. You are standing at the threshold between who you had to be and who you are becoming. And that threshold is not meant to be rushed. For now, it is enough to recognize this moment for what it is. Not a dead end, but a pause filled with meaning, even if that meaning has not yet revealed its final form. If nothing in your life seems to be working anymore, and you've been carrying the quiet fear that something has gone wrong, let this be the one thing you take with you. According to Carl Jung, the psyche only withdraws meaning from a life it is ready to transform. This phase is not asking you to fix yourself, or to push harder, or to return to who you once were. It is asking you to stay present long enough for something deeper to take shape, even if you cannot yet name it, plan it, or explain it to anyone else. Individuation does not announce itself with clarity. It begins in silence, in doubt, in the unsettling feeling that the old answers no longer apply. If this video resonated with you, it's likely because you're standing at that threshold yourself, between an identity that no longer fits and a future that has not yet revealed its form. You don't need to rush this process, and you don't need to walk through it alone. If you want to explore these psychological transitions more deeply, through Carl Jung's work, through the hidden logic of the psyche, and through the moments we are never taught how to navigate, you're welcome to subscribe to this channel. And I'm curious, have you noticed something in your life that stopped working, not because you failed, but because you outgrew it? If so, you can share it in the comments. Sometimes recognizing the moment is the first step toward becoming who you truly are.